Hello and welcome to this Consult a Specialist video. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Alison Reeves, who is the owner of Eagle Words, and she helps companies create great content that will grow their business and build their brand. And she has extensive experience in technical writing, and that is our topic for today. Welcome, Alison. Great to have you with me today.
Hello there, and thank you for inviting me.
My pleasure. So let's start off with, when you talk about technical writing, what do you mean and where does it fit within the customer journey in your view?
Well, I think it fits all the way through, actually. And it's from the moment that the customer notices you as a business, right through to them actually using your product. Mm-hmm. So it's actually something that goes through every stage of the customer journey. The flavour of the technical writing might be slightly different. So, for example, if you're using some form of writing in your marketing, that might be slightly less formal than your policies and procedures. And it just varies slightly in the tone, and the sort of support documentation, the onboarding, the training documentation, that may be a little bit softer because you are talking to an individual more. So it goes through the whole journey that the customer takes, but it also changes, the tone can be slightly different. It's very much the tone of the business, don't get me wrong, but you can soften things a little bit at different stages to make it more relaxed, if you like.
So I think what I'm hearing is one of the key things, or two key things really, is the purpose of what that writing is, but also who the audience is as well, because you'd be speaking to slightly different audiences, and there'd be a different reason for writing it.
That's right. I mean, we all know the thing about marketing is identifying your target market, but that, you know, we try to speak to an avatar, if you like, our sort of our image of what our target market looks like. But when they become, when you start onboarding them and then they become customers, they're more like individuals. So we need to treat them that way. So, you know, that's how the tone might change slightly. And the level of detail and information that you give people will change as well.
Yeah. And I suppose, you know, I talk about sort of the stakeholders versus the users, and actually in the marketing, the software companies are likely to be talking more to sort of senior leaders and so on, whereas when it gets to things like training documentation or support documentation, you're talking to the users at that point, aren't you? So
absolutely. Yeah. So your target market sort of might change slightly. I mean, it might not. Sometimes it does. It depends on who your target market is. If you're targeting small SMEs, for example, the person you target when you're marketing might be the same person you target as a user. But if you're targeting larger companies, then obviously you need to persuade the people that have the buying power to start with, and you need to persuade them that your software is a good investment. So then that would be different. You're talking to a different person to the person who's actually going to use the software at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And I think that's really important to bear in mind, is always think about. And the other thing is, I often say to people when they're writing anything actually for their business, what do you want the person that's reading this text to know, to feel, and to act on at the end of that, reading that piece of text? What message are you trying to get across? How do you want them to feel, and what do you want them to do as a result of reading it? And that will help you enormously in deciding how to structure the information that you're putting across. But also, part of the target market story is the language that you use, and whether a lot of technical companies have technical jargon, as you know, and when you're actually in the marketing arena, you might use slightly more technical information if you know that will help you with the sale. But when you come to dealing with individuals, they don't always understand what that language looks like. They don't understand what those words mean. And most people don't go and look it up or Google it. They'll just assume, make an assumption. So your message gets lost. So it's really important at every stage to think about your target market, what their expectation is, what sort of language you should be using. I mean, you don't have to do it sort of like, it's not an onerous thing. It's just something you do with each piece of content that you produce.
Yeah.
It's part of the process of producing that content. It comes right at the beginning.
So some great advice in there already, thank you. And I think you've got already touched on a few things that I want to explore. So before, we kind of already touching on some common mistakes, but before we go on to that, what would you say is the impact of getting technical writing wrong?
Well, I mean, you could go through every stage actually and have an impact. I mean, obviously, if your marketing is wrong, you're not going to get any business.
Yep.
But I think you can really switch people off. I mean, I've actually worked quite extensively, for example, on help systems and training and support for my clients' customers. And the outcome of that has been a vast reduction in the number of help calls that they get. So, they might have a help desk and that becomes much smaller, or in some cases redundant, if your documentation is right. Because obviously there are some cases where people just won't use something if they don't understand it. But there's lots of cases where people will just get in touch and say, look, help, I don't understand this, And that's what happens, is the actual impact on you as a business is that you end up doing a lot more work actually.
Yeah, and I've got an example of that actually. Someone I was talking to the other day, she's a solo business owner, and she's bought a cloud-based product. And because she's just a solo owner, she's got, I think, the basic package, and she just goes through the main process to get help. But she's tried to use the documentation, she's not been successful. She's then got in touch with the support team, and they've essentially said, well, there's this documentation, follow that. And she's turned around and said, yes, but that's not helping. I can't get where I need to be from that documentation. And she's got really, really frustrated, and she's at the point of cancelling her subscription and walking away. So it does have a big impact, doesn't it?
I think the other thing as well is it's keeping it up to date. I mean, I use online software. For example, I use an online package for my accounting. And I get a bit stuck sometimes because I'm no accountant. I always say I'm good with words, but rubbish with numbers. But sometimes I want to do something and I think, well, how on earth do I do that? And I'll go and have a search around the help, and then I'll find some help, and then I'll find that it was actually relevant to 2 versions before because they haven't updated it all. So I think what's really important is to have an actual plan for your documentation, because I know we're just talking about the impact now, but the point is, if you actually even have a help system which you're not updating, I mean, I did a help system for one company, I'm not going to talk names, but they insisted on maintaining a really bad help system that I sort of inherited it in terms of looking after it. And it was absolutely rubbish. It basically described different things, but it didn't take the user through any logical process. And also it was the sort of software where you could do things in probably one of 7 ways and get to the same result, but they didn't explain that, and they didn't take people through that, or people would get halfway through and get stuck, but they wouldn't invest in actually rejigging the help system. So there was an awful lot of stuff in there that was actually redundant because they'd actually taken that feature away, or it wasn't available anymore, or for some reason or another. And I think that is the frustrating thing about it, is the user will use documentation if it's up to date and if they can find what they want. And the other thing about that is you have to have a delivery method that allows them to search for what they want and to actually find what they want relatively quickly. Because what they forget, it's like when you go to the doctors and the dentist, isn't it? You sit there and you wait and you wait and you wait. and you get frustrated because you think, well, my time's important too. And, that is the point with users. A lot of them are a little bit limited in their time that they can spend on your software. So you want to make it easy for them. The easier you make it, the more they'll love using it. And the other thing is, the more they'll love shouting about it and telling everybody how great it is. And that's worth so much to companies.
And I suppose that's, isn't it, that's, we're talking about impact of getting it wrong, but actually the impact of getting it right is that adoption, that loyalty, and then, like you've said, that advocacy of, wow, this is amazing, a great product, great service, great documentation.
Let's face it. I mean, we can all go and do a review for a piece of software, but you go on social media and people are talking about things like, oh, what can I use for such and such, or I'm stuck because I need to use that. If you've got a product that you use that you absolutely love, every time somebody talks about something or a problem that software solves, you find yourself saying, oh, you ought to use X, Y, and Z because it's absolutely brilliant. It does this, it does that, it does the other. And for some reason, that is like gold dust, really. I mean, that is better than a review in some ways, because it's actually, I mean, in many cases, I've actually left a link to something because I've been really pleased and I like how I like how it works. And I'll say, oh, well, I use such and such, and here's a link to it. So you're actually sending people to the website half the time. So I think the impact of getting it right and wrong is quite big, really.
Yeah, definitely.
At the bottom up, when people think in terms of marketing, what they tend to do is they tend to think of the sale. What they don't look at is the attrition rate. So they don't look, I think that's the right word, they don't look at the people that are, they've bought into it, but 2 months later they're leaving because they haven't, so, and I think a lot of companies need to look at both ends of the process and say, well, what is going wrong that's causing people to not maintain this?
Yeah, definitely. And as you know, that I'm a big believer in that, and that's why I do what I do. And one of the points that I want to pick up on actually is when you said about people being able to do what they want to do. So I know one of my pillars, as you know, is taking a task focused approach rather than a system focused approach. And you were saying about searching, well, people need to be able to search based on what they're trying to do, don't they, rather than the name of a feature, because they don't necessarily know what that feature is called, or exactly what they're looking for within the system.
Absolutely. And I mean, I can go back probably 10, 15 years, right? And I was writing help systems. And what we used to do we used to divide the help system into sections. So we'd have a main section which looked at the actual concept of the software and all the things people needed to know. But then we'd have a big task section which said, these are all the tasks you can perform, how to add a customer, how to remove a customer, how to do this, how to do that, how to do the other. And all of that was in the help. So they could actually, I mean, in the old days, you'd have the help attached to the software. So you could literally press a button and the help will pop up, and you could either access it by going directly to something that was relevant to that page, or you could get the help up and look in the contents, and so the contents are structured in a logical way. And then there was a third section which was basically a list of all the fields and what you could and couldn't do. And then the software development guys would link that help, the field help, into each individual field. So you could be sitting on a field like a telephone number field or a whatever field, and it would tell you what you could and couldn't put into that field. Now that is critical, because a lot of software is a form of database in some respects. So if you're not entering information in the correct way into the correct fields, you're not going to get the outcome that you want at the other end. And I think you can't assume, I mean, it's like when you put phone numbers in, do you put the spaces in or don't you? Some software allows you to, some doesn't. And you go online sometimes, and actually if you put it in without the space, they actually send you messages to tell you, when your package is arriving. But if you put a space in, for some reason it doesn't read it and you don't get it, but nobody tells you that. So I think this is about being, and the other thing is that often with software, new products are often built on old ones. So very often you can still use some of that content with future iterations, shall we say, because you can have certain, you can actually have standards that you use, and you can put that into your help. I mean, I know things are slightly different these days with the cloud, but they don't tend to have so much of the attached help like they used to have. But I think that sort of, the structure of the help should be mostly focused on a task-based approach, because that's how people think. People sit in front of the computer and they think, I want to do X, Y, Z. They don't think, they don't think of the concept of what they're doing. They just want to get that job out of the way so they can go and get the sandwich at lunchtime. That's just the way people are, isn't it?
Yeah. And you highlight a good point as well, actually, this whole idea of data, and data is a big deal these days, isn't it? And data for making decisions, and a lot of the time the data is going into a system because you want to be able to use it for some kind of purpose, but actually rubbish in is rubbish out. And I do see that actually that is often one of the challenges, is that organisations that have bought a piece of software, they're frustrated because it's not meeting the return on investment that they're expecting. And that's partly because the users aren't putting the data in the way that they need to be able to get the data out that sort of senior leadership and so on want from it. It's not making their lives easier, and so it's really important, like you say, to explain those things, and also to, wherever possible, have those things built within the system to guide the users, to help them put it in the right way. So having some kind of controls in there in terms of formats of, like you say, phone numbers or postcodes, all those sorts of things, so that actually you reduce the number of mistakes in the first place, because the system prevents them from making them. That's all really good stuff. So what are the common mistakes that you see people making?
I think the biggest mistake is making assumptions about, or the first one, making assumptions about people's knowledge. You can't do that. You'll have some users who are starting from scratch and some who are knowledgeable. So what you need to do then is you need to signpost your information in such a way that people can find what they want. So you might have an introduction or a summary or a bit at the beginning, which is a beginner's guide, or you could even call it a beginner's guide to XYZ. But the experienced person might just sort of glance over that and go to the next bit. But the person who's new to that type of software, or new to what they're trying to achieve, they can actually start at the beginning and have that grounding of knowledge. So I think it's about labeling things, giving people things the right heading, allowing people to go and find things easily. And like you say, search stuff, but sometimes even possibly having almost like a table of content structure that people can delve into. Because sometimes, you can have you can have a search structure, but how do people know what word to put in to get what they want? If you've got a new customer, you may, I think this is the second common mistake then, is actually using a lot of terminology that people may not immediately understand. Because you put something into a help system and it's not bringing it up, it's usually because you haven't put the right thing in. It's like with Google, we often refine our Google searches when it doesn't give us what we're looking for.
Yeah.
We're sort of thinking, oh, I've obviously put the wrong thing in then. But if they don't understand the terminology, so we need to have ways of having searches in there and using plain English. That's the other thing. And when I talk about plain English, what I mean is to call, I always say to people, can you explain that to your mother or your sister or your significant other? And if who's non-technical, and if they can, then that's the way you should be telling consumers how to use your product. Because at the end of the day, they're not experts like you are. They are everyday people who use everyday language, and you start throwing language. I mean, people often, I've had people say to me in my training courses, well, I've got an English language degree and I want people to know it. And I'm like, well, yeah, but it isn't about you. Yeah, the customer.
That's really interesting, actually, because that touches on ego, and I'm actually interviewing Mary Gregory around ego. So that's be another video for people to check out. But it is true, isn't it, that ego does come into play in that.
And the other thing,
sorry, I interrupted you.
No, it's okay. No, I probably interrupted you too. But the other thing I find as well is that there is language changes over time. I mean, I've been writing for many, many years, and I've seen it in my career, how things change. And there's a lot of people still stuck in the 50s when it comes to formal writing and formal communication. And I see that an awful lot in the stuff that I get, in that they feel they have to be really formal. But actually you might have to be formal in your policies and procedures, but you don't have to be formal when you're talking almost directly through the words to your customer. If you use contractions, for example, saying will instead of we will, it just softens everything and it's easier to read. And I think the problem that a lot of people have is they don't understand what makes things easy to read. And I mean, another little hobby horse of mine is capitalization, because people capitalize everything. In actual fact, if you remove most of it, it's much easier to read. Mm-hmm. It actually, there's something that happens in the brain, and a capital letter is like a little wall that you come up against when you're reading, and it stops you for a second. So if your content is full of sort of like unnecessary capital letters, you're going to find people find it really hard going. They won't necessarily know that. They won't understand that. But and it's silly things like having really long sentences where if you find that you're having to put a load of punctuation in a sentence, it's too long. That's the easy way out of it. So those are the sort of common mistakes I see. So it's not understanding the target market, it's getting the language wrong, being too formal, or what sometimes not. But I mean, a good example of a difference in formalities, you go and have a look at, say, Virgin Media, a good example of very relaxed communication, because that's their brand. Some of it is to do with their brand. And I get that, but also there's different levels depending on the type of document that you're producing. So hopefully that gives people a few tips. I've rambled a bit there, haven't I? But there you go.
No, it's brilliant. And it's made me think of two things you saying about that capitalization piece. I learned that, and I can't remember, I think I was on a course or something. We were talking about flip charts. And I always used to write on flip charts and whiteboards in capitals because I was taught that it tended to be neater. But then someone pointed out to me, and they drew up on this flip chart, the difference that it has on the brain. And so, I've now realized that actually with my flip charts, I don't do everything in capitalization because it's actually easier to read. If I don't. So yeah, it's a really.
Let me give you an example of a minor level, which is something that everybody could change if they wanted to. If you're describing somebody's job title, like account manager or sales director, unless it's attached to somebody's name, you don't capitalize it. You don't put the capitals at the beginning of each word.
Yeah. And
people find this really weird because it's not something that they were taught necessarily, but it is common practice. It is good best practice in writing, shall we say, and it's grammatically correct. And what it does is it removes a level of words with a capital letter at the beginning of them, which is what, again, that is that sort of wall that you come up against. And I think, I mean, when it comes to headings, you can go two ways. You can either capitalize each significant word. So if you've got and, of, those sort of words, you don't capitalize those. Or the more modern way of doing it is to write the whole set, apart from the first word, you write the whole heading in lowercase, but you would just capitalize nouns, like if you use the word London or, something like that. And a great example that I use on my training courses is head office. So the only time you would capitalize the phrase head office is if the building was called head office.
Yeah.
If the building is called something else or it's just an address, head office becomes all lowercase. And actually, when you look at it, it becomes much easier to read because you haven't got all those things you're banging up against when you're trying to read. I've got loads of little tips like that I use for people, but
that's been really helpful for me because I've always wondered about that, like job titles and things, because I go, well, is it a name or is it not a name? But you've just answered that question for me. So I've learned something today. So thank you very much.
Excellent.
So what are your sort of 3 to 5, however many you've got, top tips for software companies to improve their technical writing so it will help drive software adoption?
Right. One of the big things that has been important over the years is don't ask your software designers to write your help documents. They're designers, not writers. And what I found is that what you get when you, and I'm talking generally, there might be some good writers who are designers as well. I'm not saying that's it's impossible, but I'm talking generally. It's a generalization. They're into their software. You get short, sharp, highly technical content that's full of jargon if you ask designers to write it. What works really well is where you get somebody who does technical writing to work with the designer. So it might be that the designer might do a little bit of content just to explain what it is, but then you get somebody who can translate that into everyday English. And the benefit of that, this might be more than one top tip, I don't know, but I always, I think I've mentioned this to you before, when I was writing or when I write help stuff, I see part of my job as sort of bug fixing because I haven't been involved in developing or writing that. I like to read the business specs that they produce before they start, because that helps me understand what they're trying to achieve with the software and what the user would want to achieve with the software. But then part of my job is to actually go through as if I'm a user to document it, because that tells me where the problems are. But it also allows me to send messages to the developers to say, this field's not working, or this isn't connecting to this, or do you know what I mean? It's like a bug fix. And I see that as a really good sort of almost a review process as part of it. And I think with working together with the developers, it means you get a much better product. I mean, sometimes it can help educate your developers as well in terms of thinking about the customer. So that's a big thing for me. The other thing is to have, I think you can actually produce some content that is useful across the board, and I would call that almost templated stuff. So one of the things that I always say to people is, don't just think in terms of, oh, how does the user use the software? Also think about things like your customer complaints process and procedure. So those should be really slick, you know, and actually they should apply to every product that you produce. So you only need to do it once, but do it well, you know. So have a really good policy, have a process that's in place that makes people feel that their feedback or their comment or their problem is being resolved, and have some guarantees in place in terms of turnaround and all that sort of thing. But if you've written that once and that's part of it's a bit like your privacy policy on your website, isn't it? You know, once it's there, it's there. You don't have to keep rewriting it all the time. So there's some stuff like that you can do. And the other thing I guess is to store these things in a place that are easily accessible. So for example, when I get onboarded to do a project for a client, it's really frustrating to me when, I mean, sometimes it's just in their heads, you know. But if you have got stuff, like if they've got policies and procedures that are relevant to what we're doing, it's great if they can just put their hand, either share the subdirectory with me or, you know, send me a copy over so I'm aware of what they've got, and I can actually help make that process a lot smoother. So that's another one. And I guess top tips, make sure that you are writing in plain English, that you're not talking what I call gobbledygook, which is, something that people just can't get, or don't understand. The thing is, if you write your technical writing, if your technical writing is really good, what happens is it becomes a little bit invisible because it's good. It becomes crunchy when it's not good because it starts grinding and it starts causing problems. And I think, unfortunately, because of that, people underestimate the value of it. So one of my top tips is to put value onto that, because it will bring you more business. You will retain more customers. You will have people using your products better. You will save money because you won't have a heavy overhead with help system. I mean, some do have a help desk, some don't. They just have customer services now. But the problem is that the competition is fierce amongst a lot of these companies, because it's not that hard to produce something that's very similar to somebody else's. So the competition is fierce. So what is your point of differentiation? And one of those can be around your customer service and the way you help people and the way you support people. You've got to always think of being a step ahead with all these things.
And that's one of the things that I'm really trying to help organizations see, particularly with these consult specialist videos, is those things that other companies won't be thinking about, that will make those differences, that will make them have a much more positive impact. I just want to pick up actually on what you were saying about sort of using the right people with the right skills for a particular role. So you talked about not using developers for technical writing, and I say the same thing about the training as well. So sometimes it's really easy to use the subject matter expert for the training, but that means that they potentially use too much jargon, they get too technical, go into too much detail, rather than putting themselves in the user's shoes. But the other
both, I mean, I've often written the content. I've often produced the training courses because I've been involved in working out how to use the software, and in many cases I've also delivered it as well, because they've recognized that they need somebody who understands the customer's point of view. But there are some software houses that have permanent technical writers, they have permanent trainers, and that's great. But for smaller companies, it doesn't have to be that onerous. I mean, there's a lot of us out there who do what I do on a freelance basis, so you don't have to employ us all year round. You can bring people in when you need them. And I mean, I have a number of customers, if you like, or clients who I dip in and out all the time depending on what their need is, and I go and do work for somebody else when they don't need me, and it works out quite well, in that sense.
And I think one of the things with that, particularly with sort of like you say, the technical writing, sort of maybe the training design and even the training delivery, because I do that for my clients, some of them, and it does allow that more flexibility, because actually some of that stuff comes in peaks and troughs, doesn't it? You don't necessarily need someone doing technical writing all of the time. You need to bring them in maybe with the product roadmap of when you're making major changes, to then go, right, okay, well, let's book Alison in to kind of do that work with us on that, so that we have all of that documentation updated and ready for when the product...
What's usually helpful is when you're planning a project is to identify when you think you'd like somebody to come in. But I also think it's quite important to connect with them and actually say you understand how long it's going to take. I mean, sometimes with technical writing, it takes longer or shorter than people think. And I think, the technical author can actually help you with your plan and help pinpoint when the right times are. So it might be before I get involved in the writing, it might be that in fact, I've done it in the past. I've had copies of the business specs and the software specs. Sometimes I understand them, sometimes I don't. But also there are occasions where during the process, they may have invited me into 1 or 2 meetings that are critical around developing the software and what the outcome is to the client. So I understand that before I actually do the work.
Mm-hmm.
So, it may be that I just, somebody like, or a technical author that they decide to use can just be available at certain times. And I think that's another tip, actually. Just don't leave it till the last minute. Don't leave the technical writing to the end. I know things change sometimes with software, and sometimes we have to adjust things. But what has happened to me on a few occasions, which I absolutely hate, is they say, oh, well, we're going to allow 2 weeks to write all the documentation, so we'll slot that right at the end. And then it's just impossible to get the work done in time. They've estimated and they don't understand that they need more or less time. And also that documentation needs to be written, it needs to be tested, it needs to be reviewed to make sure it's correct. It needs to be tied in somehow to the software, which the developers tend to do. So it's not something that you can just bolt on the ends.
And like you said, it can perform a really useful role in terms of testing the software. So actually, if you build it in and actually take more of an agile approach of, okay, well, I know this bit's ready, let's write this, but then actually that tests that bit to then be able to go back around that loop if things need to be changed. So you're talking about running it alongside pretty much the whole project, aren't you? Okay, well, and breaking it down, and then you can do a final sort of test of how everything hangs together and make sure that it all works. And the other thing I want to come back to around the skills piece that kind of came into my head, we talked about sort of technical writers, trainers, developers, and so on. I think one of the things that really jumped out for me, and one of the challenge I think a lot of organisations have is with their customer support people, because to a certain extent they need to be technical because they do a certain amount of technical work, but they also have to have that kind of jargon-free, customer-centric approach, don't they? So they might on the one hand be trying to fix something in the product, but then when they're communicating back to the customer, to the user about what's going on, they need to be able to, like you say, put it in plain language, and they need to have that, both of those skills, don't they? And I think sometimes organizations struggle a little bit if they have people that are very customer service focused and do a really good job of the communicating with the customer, but aren't so good at the technical stuff, and then they've got other people that are really good at the technical stuff but don't necessarily do such a good job of
I think that can come back to the technical writing as well, because if you've documented stuff properly, those customer service people can actually educate themselves. They can find things themselves. And just one point, I've just made a note of it while you were talking because it popped in my head, is one thing that I have seen in companies is where things aren't documented properly, they're often in people's heads. And you can actually have customer support staff, for example, that support customers that are absolutely brilliant at what they do. And when they leave, they take it all with them. Yeah. Whereas if you've got systems that are well documented, it's an asset to the business because you've always got that information. Yeah. And one of the things I see companies doing a lot is letting valuable information go outside the business and not be documented and be lost forever. And I think it's important to think of your technical documentation in that way. And that's not just for your software, that's for your whole business,
Yeah. Yes, and you've reminded me, one of the organisations I used to work for, they actually introduced some targets for the customer support teams to write documentation. So they introduced a knowledge base, and actually they changed it so that they switched off the phones actually and directed customers to the knowledge base first to reduce the calls, and then if they couldn't find what they were looking for, they would then log a ticket, and then an engineer would get in touch. But in order for that process to work, the quality and the knowledge base had to be good, and actually they asked the customer support people to contribute to that, because they were the ones that were dealing with the customers a day in, day out. They knew what kind of questions were being asked to then put those solutions in to the commonly asked things, and in a way that would help the customers, and put it in a way.
And I think the other thing is you can approach that sort of project in a very structured way. So you can have a template that people complete.
Yes.
And I've done this before with clients, is we've come up with a little bit of a template to help those people get their thoughts onto paper, and then they write it out, and then I've come in and just done an edit, in other words, made it really readable. So it's actually a better use of my time in some respects. It's getting the direct information out of their employees' heads, and it's a win-win for everybody. That, you know, there's lots of benefits,
This has been so interesting and also so useful. So many great tips in there, Alison. So I really appreciate your time today. What I'll do is I will put your contact details at the end of the video. So if anybody wants to get in touch with you directly about how you might be able to help them, or to talk about technical writing and copywriting in a bit more detail, then they'll have your details. So thank you so much.
It's my pleasure. It's been fun talking to you.